In an interview, he clearly didn't expect to go this far. David Phelps said something that quietly closed a door. You'll understand why it landed so differently than anything he'd said before. He wasn't angry, he wasn't grieving. That's what made it so final. When a man speaks about a chapter of his life with that particular kind of peace, the kind that comes from a decision already made and fully settled, there's nothing left to negotiate. And for the millions of people who have followed David's voice through 3 decades of homecoming recordings and gospel stages, what he communicated in that moment was something the gospel community deserved to hear plainly. This video is going to give you that plainly. Not as gossip, not as rumor, but as the honest account of where David Phelps is now, how he got there, and why the people closest to him, including his wife Lori, have been saying the same thing in their own words for longer than most fans realized. Stay with us through the 10-minute mark, because that's where the pieces of this story come together in a way that reframes everything you thought you knew about why David left, and why this time is different. If you've only recently discovered David Phelps through a clip someone shared on a Sunday afternoon, you may not fully understand what you're actually hearing when that voice opens up. David Phelps is not simply a talented singer. By almost any measure, he stands as one of the most technically gifted tenors to ever take a gospel stage, with a natural range that seems to defy what the human voice is supposed to accomplish. And yet the thing that has always separated him from mere vocal spectacle is what lives behind the notes. There's a sincerity in David's singing that this audience has always recognized. You cannot manufacture it, and you cannot train it into someone who doesn't already carry it. David Phelps has always carried it. Born in 1970 in Tomball, Texas, he came to music not as a hobby, but as a calling. Serious vocal study followed, then Baylor University, and by his mid-20s, he had developed into something the gospel world hadn't quite seen before. In 1994, Bill Gaither made the call that would define a generation of homecoming recordings. He invited David to join the Gaither Vocal Band, and what followed was a partnership that gospel fans would come to regard as simply permanent, as natural and right as anything in Christian music. For those who discovered faith through the homecoming videos of the 1990s and early 2000s, David wasn't just a member of a vocal group. He was a presence. He was the voice that would reach the upper register on Jerusalem and hold a note so long, so purely, that grown men in the audience would simply bow their heads. He was the young tenor standing alongside Bill Gaither and Guy Penrod and Mark Lowry, who somehow held his own, and on the right night made even the veterans turn and look. For millions of fans who grew up watching those videos in their living rooms, in their church basements, on long car rides with their families, David Phelps was part of the soundtrack of their faith. And that is why what he has been saying in recent years, carefully, without drama, but with unmistakable clarity, has mattered so deeply to so many people. The fuller picture of what he's actually communicating has taken time to come into focus, but it's in focus now. David's first departure from the Gaither Vocal Band came in 2004, and at the time most fans accepted the surface explanation. He wanted to build a solo ministry. He had a young family to be more present for, and an artistic vision that extended beyond what a vocal group format could fully contain. All of that was true. David released solo albums, toured on his own terms, and continued to perform with a level of excellence that kept him firmly in the hearts of gospel fans, even as his name was no longer on the Gaither Vocal Band roster. He returned to the group in 2007, and for a while, it felt like the family had been made whole again. Pay attention to that word though, family. Because that's the thread that, when you pull it carefully, explains everything that came after. During those years inside the Gaither Vocal Band circle, David and his wife Lori were raising their children, and the homecoming recordings, beloved as they were, came at a cost. Traveling, extended time away, the rhythms that touring demands, and that touring always demands at the expense of something else. David has spoken about this in interviews over the years with the kind of measured honesty this audience will recognize as genuine. He wasn't complaining, and he wasn't casting blame on the Gaither organization, or on the road itself. He was being truthful about the arithmetic of a life spent traveling, and what that arithmetic does to a family across a decade. His daughter Maggie has grown into a performer in her own right, having inherited her father's voice in a way that has left audiences genuinely stunned. The pride David carries when he speaks about his children, about the life he and Lori have built together, is not a small thing. In the way he talks about it, that life is the thing, the central thing. But there is another layer to this story that goes beyond family scheduling, and it's the layer that most coverage of David Phelps has been reluctant to name directly. Stay with us here, because what David has shared about his vocal health, and what Laurie has confirmed separately about what these years of performing at that level have cost him physically, reframes everything that comes before it in this story. A voice like David Phelps's is not a given, and it does not continue unchanged, unaffected by the demands placed on it, decade after decade. Every singer who operates at David's level, who reaches those notes, who performs with that kind of intensity night after night, carries a quiet understanding that the instrument is mortal, even when the spirit is not. David has been open, in the measured way that is characteristic of him, about the physical reality of maintaining his voice at this stage of his career. He has spoken about the discipline it requires, about what he can and cannot do now that he could do at 30. And for those listening carefully to recent interviews, there is something in how he frames his current work, his solo concerts, his more selective appearances, that sounds less like artistic choice and more like stewardship, protecting what he has left, being honest with himself and with his fans about what that protection requires. This is not a story of decline, and it would be a mistake to frame it that way. David Phelps at 55 still delivers moments that leave audiences breathless. The instrument is still there, and so is the artistry. What has shifted is the calculus around how he deploys it, and whether the structure of a touring vocal group, with its fixed schedule and collective demands, is compatible with the kind of careful stewardship he now knows his voice requires. The answer he has arrived at, gradually, honestly, and without apparent bitterness, is no. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his inner circle expected to become quite so public. Across conversations and interviews over the past several years, David has grown increasingly direct about his sense of calling. Not the calling to sing, which has never wavered, but the specific calling around how and where and for whom he sings. A shift has taken place in his understanding of his own ministry, a move away from the institutional framework of a group, even a group as historically significant as the Gaither Vocal Band, and towards something more personal, more intimate, more directly connected to the people in the room on any given evening. He has talked about wanting his concerts to feel like conversations, about wanting the faith dimension of his work to occupy the foreground, not the background, about the difference between being a world-class voice in a world-class group and being a minister who happens to carry a world-class voice. That distinction matters, and it matters especially to fans who have watched David's faith deepen across the decades, who have seen him move from the young tenor with the astonishing range to something quieter and more grounded, something pastoral, in the truest sense of that word. Laurie Phelps, in her own public appearances alongside David, has said much the same. With warmth and conviction, she has spoken about their life together, about the family they raised, and about what she calls the second chapter of David's ministry. Not a lesser chapter, a different one. One built around the life they chose, rather than the life the road had been choosing for them. What both of them have communicated, in the way people communicate things they have thought about deeply and decided about finally, is that the Gaither Vocal Band chapter has closed. It was a rich chapter. It produced recordings that will outlast all of them. But it is not a chapter that will be reopened. David has said this without anger, and without regret, with the calm certainty of someone who knows what he is called to now, and is no longer pulled by what he was called to before. For those of us who have followed David's journey across the years, who watched him grow from the young man in the homecoming circle into the artist he is today, there is something clarifying about hearing him speak this way. It would be easy to read his distance from the Gaither Vocal Band as loss, as something that happened to him rather than something he chose, but the fuller picture tells a different story. David chose his family. He chose the stewardship of his voice. He chose a version of ministry that answered a calling he felt more deeply than the one that had shaped his most famous years. In a world that constantly pressures artists to keep returning to what made them famous, to keep giving audiences the version of themselves most easily recognized, David made a different choice. He chose to be faithful to where he is, rather than nostalgic for where he was. For those who have followed this ministry since the early homecoming days, there is a question worth sitting with, and that question is this: what does it actually mean to steward a gift? Not just to exercise it, but to protect it, to direct it with intention, to recognize when a particular expression of it has run its course. David's answer, lived out quietly over the past decade, seems to be that stewardship requires honesty. Honesty about limits, honesty about calling, honesty about what the next chapter genuinely looks like, rather than what the previous chapter's fans might wish it looked like. If that resonates with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Many of you have followed this ministry for 40 years or more, and you know better than most what it means to stay faithful through seasons that don't look the way you expected. One break to me, two mothers are tie. Mind you, there's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet, and it has to do with a broader pattern that has quietly shaped the Gaither Vocal Band across the decades. David Phelps is not the first extraordinary voice to leave that circle and not return. Michael English, whose tenure with the group in the late 1980s and early 1990s produced some of the most celebrated recordings in the Homecoming catalog, found a path that led him away from the group's structured environment and toward a more independent ministry. Russ Taff, another voice of almost frightening power and emotional depth, has worked largely outside the formal Gaither Vocal Band structure for most of the past 2 decades, though his appearances in the broader Homecoming community have remained deeply treasured. What these departures share is not bitterness, not visible conflict, not the kind of rupture that leaves damage in its wake. What they share is a recognition, arrived at differently by each man, that a certain kind of calling requires a certain kind of freedom. The Gaither Vocal Band, for all its history and beauty, and its place in the heart of American gospel music, is a framework, and frameworks that serve an artist at one stage of a career do not always serve him at another. Bill Gaither has understood this better than perhaps anyone. Over the years he has communicated, in various forms, that what he has always wanted for the artists in his orbit is genuine flourishing rather than the performance of loyalty. The Homecoming recordings were never about capturing these voices in amber. They were about celebrating what was alive in them at a particular moment. And when a voice, a spirit, a calling moves into a new moment, the celebration continues. It simply moves too. David and Bill have maintained a relationship marked by mutual respect and genuine affection. No estrangement lives here. Only an honest acknowledgement of what has passed and what has begun. And in the gospel world, where authenticity is the currency that everything else is bought with, that kind of acknowledgement is worth more than a reunion tour could ever be. What comes next for David Phelps and his family is something his fans will follow with the same attention they have given his career for 30 years. He is not disappearing, and he is not stepping away from music or from ministry. He is doing what the best artists eventually do when they have enough self-knowledge and enough faith. He is following the specific thread of calling that belongs to him and only him, wherever it leads. Maggie Phelps has already shown the world that the gift passes. Lori has shown the world what it looks like to build a life alongside someone whose voice belongs, in some fundamental way, to more people than just you, and to do it with grace and groundedness. And David himself has shown the gospel community something they may not have expected from the young tenor who held that impossibly high note on a Homecoming stage back in 1994. He has shown them what it looks like to grow up in public and to do it well. One question this story leaves genuinely open is not really a question about David Phelps. It's a question about legacy. When a voice as rare as his has said what it came to say in one context and moved into another, what remains? The recordings, certainly, and the performances that live in memory and on screen. But also something harder to name. A sense that the most important music David Phelps will ever make may still lie ahead. Not the music of the Homecoming stage, but something quieter, something fitted to the chapter he and Lori are living right now. Whatever that music turns out to be, fans who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing. David's story is not finished, not by a long measure. And if this story stayed with you, the next video will as well. We've been following the untold chapter behind Guy Penrod's departure from the road, and what his family has said about what that season cost them. What came out of that story is just as unexpected, and just as worth understanding.